Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be contributing to this symposium. I think I've got two jobs to do. I think I need to try and tie some of the threads together, but also I think I need to extend things in a more theological direction than anyone has so far. So I'll try and do both of those things. Those of you who listen acutely may notice my slipping between singular and plural pronouns, and there will be points at which I talk about we, and those are the points where I think I'm talking for at least the majority of my colleagues in the project, and other points where I go singular because I realize I'm expressing my own particular point of view. And I'm not going to use PowerPoint in every audience like this. There is at least a minority of people who are not fans of PowerPoint. Well, this is your moment. This is the talk that is not going to have PowerPoint. So I think the broad idea behind this project has already leaked out, really, that we thought there was something going on in biology, some kind of shift or something new, and in a holistic, systemic direction, and that this was philosophically important and welcome from a religious point of view. That's the very simple idea we had at the start of the project. And of course, as the project's gone on, we've got more subtle and nuanced about all of that. And the way I want to present this talk is in terms of how things have got more subtle as we've gone on. And in doing that, inevitably, I'm setting up a bit of an Aunt Sally of the opening position, and I hope we weren't quite as naive at the start as I may make it sound, but it's a convenient kind of communication device, I think, to present it in this way. So we've talked about a holistic biology, and what I want to make clear about that 2 years into the project is that we're not envisaging or proposing a separate kind of biology that is holistic biology in the way you might have plant biology or evolutionary biology. We're not proposing a new and separate kind of biology. What we're seeing and want to encourage and are somewhat excited by is a move in a holistic direction in biology in general. And by holistic, I mean really taking into account the complex relationships between parts and wholes, recognizing that both of those are constructs, and as Ottoline said, plants are not aware that they have parts. These are our constructs, more or less useful constructs, and the relevant whole there are different levels of analysis in which you can talk about wholes depending on what the questions are that you're trying to answer. So holistic in the sense of being interested in the relationship in some ways between parts and wholes, but not advocating a separate kind of biology, advocating and being excited by the move towards a biology that's taking into account a holistic perspective increasingly. And there's different language for this. We've mainly been using the language about holism. We've also, as Michael Reiss did in his talk this morning, used language about organicism. These are different traditions. They have a somewhat different historical lineage and different connotations, but I think biologists who would emphasize how holistic they are would also want to emphasize how organicist they are. But on the whole, these are not terms that biologists use much about themselves if they want to advance their career. I mean, they're just things that they get on and do because they realize they need to some extent, to understand what's going on in the living world. So that's my first point, what we mean by holistic biology, not a special kind of biology, but a holistic perspective in biology. And is this new? Then, in some sense, it obviously isn't, and I think at the start of the project we had an exaggerated idea of how new it was, and as Michael Reiss has emphasized, the organicist metaphor has a very long lineage in science, longer than the mechanistic metaphor, and holistic biology has been explicitly on the table for at least 100 years, so nothing new here. But I think there are shifts of emphasis in biology from time to time. It's not all in the same direction. I think there's a sort of tidal backwards and forwards moment, and the way I see the history roughly in the post-World War, Second World War period, is that there was a period when biology was very excited about the triumphs of biochemistry, and it probably did help to move things forward on that front, to bracket out some of the holistic perspective for a time. And I think science regularly does this. It narrows down, brackets out some questions in order to make progress with others. And I think biology did that in the post-war period, largely bracketed out a holistic perspective. And I think there's been a swing back in recent years. So I think there is a tidal movement going on back towards a more holistic approach to biology, which includes the kind of integrative biology that Otterlein was talking about, and the extended evolutionary synthesis, and things in ecology like the new emphasis on niche construction and so on. None of this is absolutely new, but I think there has been a shift going on. I think biology is now more open to a holistic perspective than it was a few decades ago. And another important example is, of course, epigenetics that we've heard quite a bit about in this conference. Nothing absolutely new about epigenetics, a term coined by C.H. Waddington back in the Second World War, though he might have meant something a little bit different by it from what is now meant. But what we've had, I think, in the last 10, 15 years is an increasingly good understanding of how epigenetics works. And that's what I think is new and is exciting and gives it more authority than it's had before. At several points in this project, we wondered in the early days what systems biology was and whether that was another word for what we were interested in. And I think at the first meeting we had, Michael Reiss said words to the effect that he didn't know what systems biology was. And at the time, I kind of thought Michael ought to know what systems biology is. But actually, I think he was quite right in what he said. And I think there's so much confusion about what systems biology is that no one can really know what it is. But we've come to think that at least two different things that are meant by systems biology, and we had a very helpful conversation about this with Derek Gatherer, who's a systems biology at Lancaster University and unusually good at the philosophical issues surrounding systems biology. I think what most people mean by it is just a kind of biology in which you take a huge number of variables into account, measure as many things as you can, and then all you can humanly do with that is to put it into some kind of mathematical model. You've just got too many variables to think about in your head. So that kind of maximizing the number of variables, putting them into a complex mathematical model, I think that is what the majority of people mean by systems biology. But there's another kind of systems biology, probably a minority way into it, that really is trying to get at what's going on in biological systems and to do empirical work and theoretical work to understand that. And if that's what you mean by systems biology, it very much is what we're interested in this project. But the other kind of just put in as many variables as you can is not particularly what we're interested in. I want to move on now to some what are sometimes bogey words, determinism, reductionism, and mechanism, and say where we are with each of those. I think we started out with the idea that there was something in each of those to be wary about, but we've become increasingly discriminating about what we do and do not want to be wary of with each of those three terms. So I think determinism, the search for an understanding of determining variables is just part of what science does. And you assess how well you're doing that in terms of how well you can make predictions about what the thing you're studying will do under certain conditions. Bringing things under experimental control, that is just a scientific enterprise. But there are certain kinds of determinism which distort what's going on. And I think the one we particularly want to be wary of is mono-causal determinism, explaining what happens in one thing entirely in terms of what happens in another. And that's not basically because of any rooted ideological objection to it, though it does prepare the ground for reductionism that you might not like. The main reason for being wary of that, I think, is just that it distorts what's going on in the living world. So in biology in particular, I think there are good reasons to be wary of monocausal determinism, just because there are very few things in living creatures that can be explained and understood in that way. So that kind of monocausal determinism in the living world is really, as I see it, a hopeless project and one that is best not pursued. But as I've said, a broader kind of search for an understanding of determining variables in as far as you can, that is just a standard part of the scientific enterprise. And this leads into questions about reductionism, and I think there are stronger philosophical and theological reasons for being wary about reductionism in a complete sense. My take-home message about this is that we don't really have to worry because the conditions for reductionism are hardly ever met. So where reductionist moves are made, they're usually made ahead of time without the necessary preconditions, and then it is not a difficult job just to blow the water on them. There is this idea that if you have a complete explanation of something, then the thing that you've explained can, in some sense, be marginalized, and there are slightly different ways of doing that. You can say that it's just an epiphenomenon, that it's not what it appears, it's not quite real, you don't need it in your descriptive language. In some way or other, you can kind of get rid of it. And I think theologians, but also humanists, don't like that move because it results in getting rid of some of the more interesting aspects of creatures and especially of humans. So making out that all we are really is in Crick's phrase, for example, in his book, Astonishing Hypothesis, just a bundle of neurons. That's where you go with that kind of reductionism in the end. But, and this is my point, you can only make that reductionist move if you have a complete explanation of the thing that you're explaining. And biology hardly ever gets a complete explanation. There are one or two interesting exceptions, perhaps rare genetic disorders that seem to follow a Mendelian pattern or something like that. But in the main, you don't get complete explanations. So if you find someone who has a penchant for reductionism and they want to make a reductionist move, I think the thing to do is to challenge them to produce their complete explanation. And they usually haven't got one, of course, and it's usually done on a wing and a prayer and a belief that they will be able to get a complete explanation just a little bit down the road, but they actually haven't. And so what I would want to say to them is, come back when you've got your complete explanation and then we can talk about reductionism, but until then, just hold your horses. So I don't think we, from a theological point of view, we need to worry as much about reductionism as we sometimes have. Then mechanism. there's a kind of conflict about mechanism, isn't there? Biologists are wanting to find the mechanisms that are going on in living creatures. But there is this antipathy in some circles to mechanistic biology. I think this is a non-problem because I think mechanism is being used in two very different ways. And if you get that clear, then I think the apparent conflict disappears like snow in the sun. And I was helped to realize this from a nice passage in a book on the philosophies of science by Rom Harry, who lectured to me in philosophy of science when I was an undergraduate here 50 years ago, and it's always a pleasure to go back to Rom Harry. He distinguishes two importantly different ways in which mechanism is used in science. One is when you're talking about a mechanical contrivance, and the other is when you're just using it as a rather general word for a detailed explanatory mechanism, detailed explanatory mechanism. When biologists are looking for the mechanism by which something is working, then they're looking for a detailed explanatory model. And I think they're not assuming that it's necessarily going to be mechanistic in the sense of being like a mechanical contrivance. I think that metaphor generally doesn't work very well in the living world. And it's that kind of mechanistic biology that some theologians and humanists feel wary about. But as I say, I don't think that is what biologists generally mean when they talk about biological mechanisms. There may be other things going on here, and I'm very much with where Michael Reiss ended up at the end of his talk about there being a place for both of these fundamental metaphors, the mechanistic and organismic variables in science. And they probably each have some place in various different sciences. But in general and increasingly, I think I want to say it depends on which science you're doing, and the situation is very different if you're working in the physical sciences and if you're studying the living world. And by and large, I think the organicist metaphor works much better for the living world for fairly obvious reasons than it does in the physical world, and vice versa. So I think here I probably would have a slight difference of emphasis from the latter part of Michael's talk, which was presenting organicism as a rather specialist minority tradition within science. And it is there. And you find full-blown organicists who are very enthusiastic about their organicist basis. But I think what we've been focusing more on in this project is the move towards taking wholes into account in ordinary, everyday, mainstream biology. And that is a kind of everyday organicism, if you like. And I think in biology, it's a very important one. I'm just going to get myself a sip of water, and then I move into theology. So I can start my theological remarks from where Michael started his, which is a general feeling that organicist science is more Christian-friendly, and that's an intuition that I broadly share. But the point I want to make now is that isn't equally true of all Christians. There are different Christian traditions, and how people's gut feelings about this depends on which tradition you fall within. I would place myself mainly in the liberal Protestant tradition, and the majority of work on science and religion has come out of that religious tradition. But there are at least three other major thought traditions within the Christian family There was the thought of the Eastern churches, very much influenced by the Greek fathers, the thought of the Catholic tradition, very much influenced by Aquinas, and the thought of conservative Protestantism, very much influenced by Calvin. And as an aside, I think it would be really fascinating if someone would write a science and religion book going through the core issues in the field and setting out how those 4 different traditions tackle them, as I think there are very interesting divergences and the scope for much more dialogue between these different Christian traditions than has yet come out in the science and religion conversation. So I think for most people like me in the liberal Protestant tradition, there is a gut feeling that organicism, holism are Christian friendly. But just to take one example, if you're approaching things from a more Calvinist position, then it looks very different. I think Calvinists don't worry about determinism in the way that some other Christians do, because determinism just seems very reminiscent of what they've been thinking about in terms of predestination. It just seems to be discovering all over again in the natural world something that you've been thinking about in your theological discussions anyway. So I think that there isn't the same squeamishness about determinism in the Calvinist tradition. This is something that Jim Moore brought out very interestingly in his now quite old book on the post-Darwinian controversies, that it was the small number of Calvinist evolutionary theologians who were much more comfortable with natural selection than the more liberal theologians who took on board the general idea of evolution but balked at some of the other more specific aspects of it. And I think it also depends on who you think is the main enemy. And there's been an interesting shift here between the early and modern periods. If you go back to the 17th century, I think the main enemy of Christian orthodoxy is some vague kind of pantheism. And if you want to hold the line against that, then you're not going to be particularly attracted by organicism as a way of holding that line. But by the end of the 19th century, and increasingly through the 20th century, atheism is coming to the fore as an alternative enemy, and probably from a Christian point of view, the more serious enemy. And if you make that shift in terms of who you think the enemy is, then that has implications for where you want to find alliances. And if your enemy is a mechanistic atheist view of the world, you may want to make common cause with organicists who are not particularly religious, but at least have some sort of broadly spiritual view of the world. So my point here is it depends what Christian tradition you're in, and it depends who you see as the enemy. But I think Michael is right that for most people in the Christian tradition, there is a gut feeling that organicism is Christian friendly. My next point is about interdependence, and this is probably the most personal point in this talk. I think the picture of the living world that's now emerging from biology is of very great theological interest. And it is a picture of a world that is interdependent, in which everything, well, not everything, many things are influencing many other things around them. It's a world of mutual influence, in which influences go in many different directions, with wholes arising from parts, of course, but also wholes influencing parts. In ecology, smaller species supporting larger ones, but sometimes larger species supporting smaller ones. It's not an atomistic world with discrete building blocks of hard stuff. It's a soft world of soft matter and soft boundaries, a world of gradients rather than clear boundaries. And we often talk about the living world as though it was made up of particular bits, and we may need to do that to find any way of talking about it at all, bits like genes and neurons and cells. But these are all abstractions or constructions, And even with a cell, there's no really hard boundary to a cell, nothing as sharp as a cell wall. There's a gradient more than a wall. It's a world, as Coleridge would have said, of distinctions rather than divisions. And I agree with Coleridge that a lot of our philosophical problems arise from taking mere distinctions and treating them as though they were divisions. And the living world, at least, is not like that. It's not a world of sharp boundaries, and we confuse ourselves if we imagine it is. So if that's how the living world is increasingly looking, and I think biology is moving in a direction that makes that view of the living world increasingly compelling, then for a Christian thinker, the living world seems increasingly to reflect the interdependence of Father, Son, and Spirit. Admittedly, different persons, though persons there is, of course, a rather technical term, different persons, but the same nature, the same substance. There is distinction here without division. And I want to suggest that the living world provides a helpful model of God's hope for humanity, and a greater recognition and enactment of our human interdependence with each other would solve many recalcitrant problems. It would, for example, help us to find a middle way between the extremes of individualism and of totalitarianism that have marred the 20th century. Humanity, it seems, needs to learn that all things interrelate. And I think we find a helpful model of that in the living world. Some might want to say a God-given model. And biology, in this sense, provides material for a very fruitful theological reflection on nature. And all this has helpful implications for understanding divine action, which has been one of the central topics on the interface between theology and science. And Niels Gregersen in our project has been very helpful here, and I wish the dates had enabled him to be here himself, but I will speak about divine action and put things in my own way. If we live in an interconnected world, God's influence on it is not going to be a matter of discrete action on God's part to bring about isolated events. It's more likely that divine action will be a matter of steering and guiding, giving a direction, or establishing what some people have called propensities in nature, so that things are consistent with God's purposes. Such things are more likely to happen. God's influence on the world is likely to be influence rather than control. And that view of divine action steers a path between a crude, simplistic understanding of special divine action in which God intervenes to make some particular thing happen, a path between that and a very general view of providence, which properly sees everything as happening under God's aegis and upheld by his providence. And the kind of in-between that we need, I think, is what has sometimes been called general divine action. And I think the vision of the living world that is being supported increasingly by contemporary biology is one that favors that view of divine action. And biology can perhaps observe something of the propensities in nature that serves God's creative purposes, though that's not to suggest a return to the old-style natural theology that tried to find evidence to support the existence of God in nature. And the evolutionary propensities towards self-organization and towards increased cognitive capacities are richly suggestive from a theological point of view. I just have one point left, and that's about dissemination and public understanding. And I want to reflect on the way that biology is often communicated to the public, which fails to take account of how complex and interrelated biological processes are. And what often comes over to the public is a crude, out-of-date, simplistic, mono-causal, reductionist biology. Why so? Why is biology so misrepresented, and who's responsible? It's partly, of course, the media, but I want to suggest that biologists themselves are often partly responsible too. And when it comes to communication with the public, they tend to oversimplify in a way that distorts. And again, I ask why. And it's partly, obviously, the fact that a simple view of biological processes is easier to popularize than a complex one. But I think there may be more going on than that. It's partly that many people find it exciting to think that scientists are getting to grips with nature, stripping away the veils, making nature reveal her secrets. And Mary Midgley, amongst others, has pointed out how remarkably sexist that kind of scientific rhetoric is. And you find it in spadesful from the 17th century onwards, and to some extent throughout the modern period. The idea that we have almost got nature sorted out is one that excites some people more than the idea that nature is a mystery that we will never quite understand. And if you get excited by the idea that we've almost got nature sorted out, then you're going to want to exaggerate the extent to which we have got it sorted out as a way of giving yourself the excitement that you want. And I think the current popularity of many of the simplistic ideas in biology comes from a research for that kind of excitement of thinking that we've got nature almost sorted out. But I think there may be something else going on, a religious agenda operating or an anti-religious agenda. And sometimes scientific ideas become popular because they point in an atheist direction. And I think the current popularity of the idea of many worlds, even though it defies scientific investigation, is popular partly because it seems as though it blocks a design argument for God breaking out again. And I suspect that some of the appeal of simplistic deterministic biology arises from the hunch that it's pointing in a non-religious direction. So those are my substantive points, and to conclude, I think our project has helped us to get more subtle and sophisticated about many of these issues, and it's enabled us to frame our conclusions more carefully than we might have done at the beginning. But I think our original hunches about biology moving in a way that can be welcomed for religious and philosophical reasons has not been overturned by these greater subtleties. Thank you.
Fraser, thank you very much. So 5 to 10 minutes for questions, specifically to Fraser, and then offline Michael will come up and join you. So Ulrika was the first person to have her hand up all in front of you.
Thank you for interesting thoughts. Thank you for interesting thoughts. Can you explain, is it crystal clear to everybody here, because it was not clear to me, why do we need to have, why is it required to have a total explanation, to know the total picture before we can do a reduction? It sounds kind of logical, but it doesn't seem to be a requirement for everyday people.
I think it is, and I think this is just a standard philosophical point. If there are things about the variable you would like to reduce that you don't yet understand, you can't be sure that the reduction is going to work. There are still other unexplained things going on. So you can't eliminate that description, that level of description, without loss. It's only if one thing is explained completely in terms of another that you can, if you want to, eliminate that level of description, and nothing is lost because you can believe that everything is still being said at a different level of description. But only if you explain your things completely.
But this sounds very good, but how come that nobody pays attention to this?
Well, and I think there is in some circles such kind of enthusiasm for the reductionist move and such confidence that we will get these complete explanations in a decade or two, that people are willing to make the reductionist move ahead of time on a wing and a prayer. And that's where the whistle needs to be blown, I think. Have you got your complete explanation? The answer will always be no. Hold your horses then.
So thank you for that very interesting talk. Now, regarding complete explanations, there are astrophysicists such as Sean Carroll out of California Tech who do claim that they have the full picture, that mathematically they have the complete equation for the behavior of the universe. And they go around publicly advertising this.
Okay.
Lawrence Krauss, another one,
Yes. Yes.
the new atheist. What would you said it's time to blow the whistle. How would you blow the whistle?
It's not my science, and I'm not familiar with that work, so I'd be wary of commenting on it. I mean, if they have got a complete explanation, that's very impressive, but I want to look critically and to be convinced that they really had.
It's on YouTube,
Okay, I'm very happy to look, but I think I'm just so ignorant of it that I can't sensibly comment here and now.
So two people. First of all, that doesn't ball when you can. Just trying to sort out, I think, making sure the microphone's going to be happy. So excuse my just pointing fingers. Yes, you're right. And then you, John, afterwards.
I have a bit challenging question, maybe. How do you make sure that the biology you talk to is not fringe biology, but mainstream biology? Because that was sometimes performed in the science-religion dialogue to talk to those science that looked neat and suitable to the unformed, and not to the one where this majority of scientists would think to.
Yes, yes. I mean, I've got one or two things I want to say about that. I think the science and religion dialogue has been over-concerned to talk to mainstream scientists. And I like the exchange between science and theology to go both ways. And I think theology has some useful nudging to do towards science. And the way this works is that science often involves more metaphysical assumptions than a lot of working scientists are aware of. And I think theologians are often quite well attuned to those and can challenge the metaphysical assumptions and suggest others, and that can lead to a different vein of scientific theorizing. So I'm happy to sort of push at science a little bit rather than just sort of kneel down under the current scientific orthodoxy. And it's part of my sort of theology and science lineage that I tend to go in this direction. And this comes from various places, but particularly from a maverick Cambridge-based group called the Epiphany Philosophers, who were unusually bold and willing to challenge contemporary science, and I think had the intellectual power to do that in a convincing way. So that's one thing. But actually, having said that, I want to make a distinction between the kind of explicit fervent organicism that Michael Reiss was talking about towards the end of his talk, and things like epigenetics, which we had this conversation yesterday. Epigenetics is not fringe science. I think any well-informed biologist now has to recognize that the way a genotype expresses itself is influenced by other factors. This is not fringe, this is mainstream.
Thank you. And then back to, that's right, John. Yeah.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk, but it also worried me or surprised me.
Okay.
Because it's now quite a long time since Oxford, in my opinion, woke up and renamed the faculty Religion and Theology. And you use the word religion to mean Christianity, and you use the word theology to mean Christianity, and that's it, mate. And that seems to me an awful shame. And, you know, and in a sense, it's also I'm a bit worried. I get no impression. I mean, I'm somebody who's moved from Christianity towards Buddhism, and you know, for everything you say, I could say I've heard Buddhists arguing in very similar ways.
Yes.
And there's been no discussion, and also there seems to be, you know, there are no Muslims that I'm aware of here, and, you know, it seems to be that the full panoply of the various major religions that have, and Judaism in particular also, have got so much to say, and it seems to be a pity that we've had a narrowing of the focus. Thank
Yes,
you.
I completely accept that stricture, and I'm completely in favour of a multi-faith approach to science and religion. And I suppose the only two things I can say in excuse are that I talk out of my own tradition, which is the one I know about, and also I didn't have time to go more broadly. But actually, what I was saying about interdependence, I was particularly influenced by a book that had been written by a Buddhist scholar, so that there are actually some broader interfaith roots than I was making explicit.
Thank you. If we want to, time for one or two more specific questions or comments addressed to Fraser. But I think we may be at perfect timing, it's got to 1:15, naturally moving into just a minute or two of a sort of break, while Offline and Michael come and join Fraser here. And then can I clarify, what we're going to do is carry on the same sort of spirit of questions and comments. Well, we've got 40 to 45 minutes. I won't expect that necessarily each of the three people on the panel will feel they have to respond to every single question or comment that's made. It'll be up to the three of them. Okay? So, when you're ready, Offline and Michael, I'm not sure Fraser will be back in a second. Look at a chair. Very gracious.
What time are we going to, Michael? 1 o'clock?
Just before 1. So as you've gathered by now, some of you feel quite comfortable not using a microphone, then please go into, as I think Offline put it, sort of stage mode if you do. Otherwise, make it very clear, just wait till Paul gets the microphone to you. So genuinely a chance for you to now ask a question or make a comment that you think might connect with more than just one speaker's focus this morning. Some of the more general issues would be especially welcome.
Hi, I have a question for, is it Ottoline? Is that how to pronounce your name? Yeah. Thanks very much. You mentioned at one point in the talk that we do everything with computational models, and I wanted to hear more about that. So, the use of mathematics. So, one of my thoughts very generally is about the power of mathematical representation and the limits thereof, and use as an instrument. And I just wondered if you could explain a little bit to me what it was you meant by what you said there. You mentioned it's about our inability to think linearly, non-linearly. Was it about the tractability of mathematical problems? Could you just say a bit more about the use of mathematics there? What were you trying to get at? I'd like to hear more. Thanks.
Okay. started doing biology some time ago, the standard way to conceptualize how you thought the different parts of your system work together was to write them on be a mat or an envelope or eventually a bit of paper with arrows that went between them. And it was you had so few parts, it was very straightforward from that to generate a hypothesis about what would happen if you did something, if you took one of them out, changed one of them, whatever. As soon as you have a loop, so as soon as you have any feedback, that becomes much more difficult. And by the time you've got 3 or 4 loops that interact with one another, where the dynamics in the arrows are qualitatively and quantitatively different, it is virtually impossible to generate a hypothesis that is, you say, okay, what would happen if I did this? You look at your diagram and you think, I have no idea. And so in order to push forward a kind of productive series of investigations that allow you to investigate whether you've really captured the important parts of the system in which you're interested, you have got to formalize those diagrams. And maths is a fabulous way to do it. And there are kind of different ways to solve the systems of equations that you use. Either you can actually solve them, or you can use computer simulation to solve them, and that's fine. And then if you're using computer simulation, there's actually different ways to embody them. They're different, we use all of them because you use whatever one works better. So you might use an agent-based model, which is actually quite intuitive, but then rather more difficult to analyze why it works, or an entirely differential equation-driven model where it's easier to analyze where it works, it's somewhat less intuitive, and you tend to have to make more drastic simplifying assumptions. So that's the kind of process. It's super useful for all kinds of reasons, not least because it requires you to limit much more explicitly what you're doing. You have to be very clear about what your assumptions are and very clear about how the variables in your maths are mapping onto the system that you're trying to look at, which spectacularly highlights the level of approximation and simplification that you're making, and that in itself is super useful.
Good. Now, there may not be, but Michael or Fraser, any comment you want to make? Fine, thank you for that. Somebody else? You're first and second. No, you're first, yeah.
After hearing Chair's comment, I thought maybe I need to say something which has to connect 3 speakers, the distinguished speaker today. So I'll just make one comment, but I have most of the question is to the first speaker. So Stephen Hawking actually, to the third speaker, Stephen Hawking actually in Brief History of Time said, we have got everything down, and he was taken to task for that. Exactly, Michelson, between the two, Michelson, Morley, I forgot which one, he also wrote in 1880 that we have got everything down in physics, so we are done, basically. So if physicists like Stephen Hawking said, so that's just a comment. And Professor Roos used the name Kepler. I will use Kepler to my question to the first speaker. You made some interesting comment about scientific method in general, and that is, I have 2 comments. The first one is that central dogma which Watson and Crick were criticizing, the DNA to RNA and RNA to protein. You said it's a dogma, but it helps to see certain things, and as reductionism helps to understand certain things. Also, you may not agree with reductionism, but it helps to see how the parts, connecting, looking at things. Actually, this is interesting. Kepler, when he tried to formulate his 3 laws of motion, Kepler's first law, the elliptical path of orbit, he tried to derive it first, positing a hypothesis called vicarious hypothesis, where he took the path of planet's path transversing the sun is in elliptical path, and given the data he got from Tycho Brahe's data, so he showed that why that is not working, the circular path is not working. So it's interesting that, even though it's not right, but it still helps us to see what's going on. The second comment is about your comment about causality. I can see that, it's so complicated system you're working with. It might be very difficult to trace back. But actually, there's a huge amount of work going on in several disciplines, and two of the most important players, one of them is Julia Pearl, actually. He's a computer scientist and also a philosopher of science, got an award. He developed, like probability theory, he developed something called do calculus. And if he's correct, then his theory could be able to capture causality. And I agree, your problems are much more complex.
There were several questions there, and I probably will forget some as I go through. But the kind of grand unifying hypothesis from physics, what can I say? My daughter is a physicist, and she works on places where the grand unifying hypothesis doesn't work. So I guess not all physicists think there is one. That's the first question. But I think more importantly, I would challenge Stephen Hawking to come and explain to me why these plants branch more in this situation than that situation. And I don't think he would get very far. And so even if it is possible to trace the answer to that question back to his equations, it's not useful. It's not useful in actually answering the questions that I want to answer. And this is where we get back to kind of pragmatism. What would you like to achieve as an individual, just from a personal intellectual satisfaction point of view, as a person who is interested in understanding the world so that we can make it better in some way for people or for whatever. If the model that you've built, however wonderful its explanatory and predictive power is in context A, if it doesn't do you any good in explanation and prediction in context B, and it's context B that you want to know about, then who cares? Yes.
Go ahead.
So that was the physicsy bit. Causality theories. This maps back a little bit onto this mathematical thing. I think once you've got maths, then you're in a much better position from a causality point of view, because it's a closed system. You have everything that's in that system. But biology is not a closed system, as we have heard. And so it immediately becomes more difficult again. Although I'm sure that there are helpful ways to think about it based on understanding from other systems. And there was something in the middle, but I can't remember what it was. Okay, right.
Does Michael or Fraser want to pick anything up?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
No, I want to make a slightly different comment. So if you've got a comment on
Okay.
this.
Okay. I just want to pick up on the idea that you hear from quite a lot of scientists that we've got things pretty much sorted, and which seems to me an implausible comment, but one that is often made. You particularly get it in artificial intelligence, and where people working in that field have, for several decades now, been claiming that in 25 years we would have a computer which was effectively like a human being, but we've passed those sort of deadlines many times, and we're still nowhere near. And as far as I know, though it's not my field, we still don't have much idea how to put together quantum mechanics and relativity theory, and we still don't have much idea how consciousness emerges from the physical brain. It seems to me that we still have really, really big things that we don't understand, and I think we might get there, but we're probably going to have to go through an awful lot of paradigm shifts before we do. And my feeling is that despite all the progress we've made in the last 200 or 300 years, which is massive, we're probably still just on the foothills of understanding everything about how things work. And we may encounter some really serious roadblocks. And there's a sense in some quarters that physics as an experimental science is grinding to a halt, because the data we now need to move it forward theoretically is just not possible to collect. So there may be unforeseen problems ahead.
Actually, what I wanted to say, you've given us a little bit of an introduction. What's worrying me this morning is I'm not sure that we're talking about the elephant in the room, and that's consciousness. And I'm coming from the point of view of a philosopher, and this is something which it always has worried philosophers, but I think it's worrying us a lot more now than it did before. I'm thinking of Thomas Nagel's book about 5 years ago, where he says, you know, the big issue is consciousness, and he's right too. So it's all very well me talking about organicism and reductionism when I'm talking about biology, but what about consciousness? Am I just sort of fiddling while Rome is burning? Or to use various metaphors like that. I think that this is something that this conversation has to go to at some point, if not this morning. We have to recognise in a way that this is almost just a prolegomenum rather than the full discussion, because I must say, for myself, until recently, I was almost with the so-called new Mysterians of thinking that consciousness is a problem which is beyond us and that we can't solve. Here we are, and have we made any advance on Descartes? Have we made any advance on Plato? I think it's interesting that one of the moves I've discovered that's becoming very fashionable in philosophical quarters is one that I think most of us, when we started in philosophy and for most of our lives, would have thought that, we lost our minds if we thought. And this is panpsychism. I've grown up thinking that panpsychism is nuts. It's the sort of thing that the Prince of Wales believes in, which is almost, a definition of what's nuts. No, I haven't said that. No, but the idea that molecules have consciousness is just crazy. And yet the alternatives are so unappealing. On the one hand, you deny there's a problem, which seems to be the position that Dan Dennett takes. You just give a physical description, and then you say, rather like the Americans should have done about the Vietnam War, well, I've won, we're going home now. But of course, it isn't, you haven't won if you've just described it. You've just ignored the problem, and I think most of us recognise that. But the other one that I think most of us have had some sort of, inclination towards is some sort of emergence that, at the one level you take it down to the bits, but then you put it together and you get consciousness. But I think more and more of us, and I'm feeling that this is just, and then a miracle occurred. I mean, I can see how you put three lines together and get a triangle, and then you get all sorts of interesting things you didn't get with the triangle, like, let's say, Pythagoras' theorem. But I'm still working in the same dimension. If I'm talking about triangles, I'm talking about the same sorts of things that I'm talking about with lines. Whereas if I'm talking about, having thoughts, I'm not talking about the same sort of thing that I'm talking about if I'm talking about 3 pounds of grey matter up here, or something like that. Now, if you go for some sort of panpsychism, at least, you're saying, well, it's there all the time. I'm not into the miracle business. Now, whether or not panpsychism makes any sense, I mean, one of the things which I find very impressive is quantum entanglement. At least it's showing that we've gone beyond what I call, this morning I introduced Descartes' res extensa. If doing something to a molecule over here affects a molecule over there, then it's sure as hell, folks, it isn't res extensa. It isn't consciousness, but at some level it's information. And I have to say that really has rocked me rather recently. And so I do think that any discussion like this ought to bring this in and recognise that this is something that's hovering there. And we can do the kind of work that we were doing this morning, but I'm very conscious that by lunchtime, I've only, I haven't really scratched at the big problem.
It's helpful from all three of you, thank you. So can I say Paul, the person second row back, that's right, yeah, thank you so much.
I have a question to Professor Watts. You mentioned at the end of the Q&A that you were partially influenced by a Buddhist thinker. I was wondering if you could name who that is and expand on it a little bit. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I've forgotten the name. It's a book that we passed between us.
Yeah, it's a book Fraser recommended to me, so I read it as well. It's a quite young woman who's argued in biology that rather than concentrating on entities separately, for example, within cells, it can be much more fruitful to really focus on the processes and the relationships, but we're both embarrassed because neither of us can remember her name. That what I've said is probably enough to find you with a decent search engine.
Simkriti Sharma.
And there's a good search engine.
Excellent.
Thank you very
much,
much,
Michael.
Now, that was that question. The next person was immediately behind you, and then it'll be you.
And this maybe is just a quip, but I wonder if that changes a couple of things we said earlier about the plant doesn't know that it has parts. So obviously there's, well, yeah. So if we're going to bring consciousness or panpsychism into the situation.
Well, yeah, okay. So
I mean, I'm not saying we need to. I'm just saying it kind of throws a lot of our shorthands into question.
I'm not sure that it does really. I mean, part of the problem with all of this stuff is that ultimately one is using words to express concepts which are fundamentally not really capturable in a small number of words. So, so you say things like plants don't know they have parts, and every single one of those words is problematic. And the context in which I'm saying it is, that it was there to indicate that the way in which we have broken down a system to describe it is a way that we have done it. It's one of the ways, it's not the only way, so on and so forth. So there's an extent to which a different way to do it is, might be better or more useful under other circumstances. And my take on consciousness, I suppose, would relate to the last slide. I don't think consciousness is currently a tractable problem, and so I'm just not worrying about it. Because if
that sounds a little bit like my bank account. Why worry? It's going to be awful anyway. But more seriously, I feel very much the way that you do, that it's just such a difficult one. You see, often the critics, people like Plantinga and Nagel, they run two problems together. One is consciousness, and the other is the origin of life. Now, quite frankly, maybe I'm naive about this, but I don't worry about the origin of life, because I think you people are going to solve that. And I know what a solution would look like. If you say to me, well, it's going to be deep sea vents rather than warm little ponds, I know what that means. And if you say, no, it really isn't RNA after all, it's all proteins, I'm not saying it is, then I know what that kind of solution would look like. If you say to me, well, don't worry about the covering, because that's a different problem and we're solving that. I know what all of these things would look like. And if I come back 100 years from now and it's been solved, I know what it would look like. The trouble is, you're right, it's consciousness. I don't know what the solution would look like. And I think that's, now whether we shouldn't worry about it is another matter entirely. I kind of feel that we should worry about it. But then I spend a lot of my time worrying about things which I know are never going to be solved anyway.
I agree. I also have no idea what the solution would look like. I'm slightly more kind of circumspect about something like the origin of life, because I do think I think one has to be always open to the possibility that there will be something in the mix which isn't something that we know what it would look like. The gap between understanding that and where we currently are is relatively small, so it's easy to leap over it mentally. But that doesn't mean to say that where we've leapt is where it will be, so to
No,
speak.
but I think it's a good question, because I think, say, 200 years ago, people would clearly have thought that life in itself was something on an order with consciousness. And they would have thought that, well, we've got to have life forces or something like that. Whereas now, maybe I'm naive about what's going on in science. Yeah. That doesn't worry. I mean, I think that one has basically been cracked, or if it's not, it's cracking, if you know what I mean. I think that people like you are able to tell me now, don't look for élan vitals and that sort of thing.
Yep.
We can basically tell you, we can't tell you all of it, but we're on top of it.
But I think that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
200 years from find it really difficult to envisage to having a relatively small gap to leap.
Yeah.
And although consciousness is a really interesting thing, and whilst it's really interesting to think about, that's not the same thing as worrying about it.
Yes, but you know, Fraser, you sitting here, you join in, you started this.
Yes.
I mean, you're the one, for instance, you threw out, what we need is a new paradigm.
Yes.
And it's as though, well, there's one there, but we haven't got it yet, but we will have a new paradigm down the road. Don't worry about it, folks. There's a paradigm waiting there for some bright young person who's going to win a Nobel Prize with it. And
Yes.
I'm not sure that there is a new paradigm.
No, I'm not sure either. And the main point I was making underneath that cheeky rhetoric was really just that I think there is an awful lot in science that we don't understand, and how much of it we ever will. I think it's difficult to guess in advance.
No, really. See, this is where I think you and I have a fundamental difference again. Oh, there's a lot of science we don't understand. Sure as hell there's a lot of science we don't understand. But I'm damn sure that these people are going to find it out.
Okay.
I'm confident that there's a hell of a lot of science that we don't understand.
Yes.
But I don't lie awake worrying about it, because I have full confidence in you people to do it at some point. Yes. Whereas with consciousness, that's my worry, is it ever going to be solved?
And I'm certainly not sure it will be solved, and if I implied so, then I was misspeaking. But actually, I'd just like to quickly pick up on another strand in what you were saying, which is about the provisionality of scientific language. I mean, I would like to think we are moving in science towards a greater recognition that how we talk about the things we're studying is provisional, and there are alternatives. And I think that in philosophy of science there's been quite a good recognition of that for a long time. Maybe Otterline is ahead of the game here, but I was encouraged to hear in your talk some sort of recognition of the provisionality of science. We can talk about bits of plants in this way, but there might be other ways of talking about it. And theologians have long had the idea of apophaticism, that there is a fundamental reality about which all human language is inadequate, and I think we are discovering a bit of apophatic humility about in scientific language, and that is very much to be welcomed.
At which point you may want to continue in silence, or you may want...
God, where is Richard Dawkins when I need him?
Sorry to point, because I said earlier, so it's the gentleman at the extreme left as I'm looking, 2 rows back from the camera.
Thanks very much. This may be another question that falls into silence, but I was wondering whether the extended evolutionary synthesis or the holistic biology that we've been talking about, exploring, has anything to say to the big challenges to evolution that get aired every so often, not from the creationist point of view and so on, but you mentioned Thomas Nagel, for example, and as I remember in Mind and Cosmos, he talks about there's just not enough time, as it were, for all these variations to work through, for things like life to pop up. Jerry Fodor had a book that created a lot of noise a few years back, but perhaps the better point was that will there be many, many different mechanisms that evolutionary biology requires, rather than just natural selection, sexual selection, and maybe 1 or 2 others? Does it have anything to say to that? And also, the phrase niche construction has been mentioned a couple of times this morning, whereas I'm aware, if I've got it right, that someone like Simon Conway Morris would want to talk much more about niche discovery, and that, as it were, there's something that's being actualized from the potentials that exist within the natural world, and so thinking about evolution as an exploratory kind of mechanism, that kind of sense. So that's quite a wide range of different issues, but those sort of meta questions around evolution from within the scientific paradigm nonetheless. Does the EES or holistic biology address any of those areas?
I think it'd be enormously helpful to have more dissemination of the extended evolutionary synthesis. And I think if we could do that, there would be a little less opposition to evolution. I mean, there are obviously hardcore creationists who are not going to be swayed by the extended evolutionary synthesis, but I think there are some sort of there's some soft opposition to evolution that comes from people who have a spiritual, anti-mechanistic view of the world, who would be much more comfortable with the extended synthesis if they knew about it than with the image of Darwinism that they have. And for that reason, I'd really like to get this out much more effectively.
I actually wanted to keep creationism on the table if possible, and what with it has anything to say to these intra-science critiques of evolution, which come from people like Favour or like Nagel, or possibly someone like Simon Conway-Morris, who wants to, it seems to extend things in a different direction.
Yeah, I want to speak on behalf of the fool now. You've said the Anselm thing. I want to be Gwynillo. I don't think we need an extended synthesis. I'm not saying that everything in evolutionary biology is finished. I think that things like Evo-Devo are tremendous, but I don't see this as an extended synthesis in a quote sense. I see this as part of the natural growth of any successful paradigm. And I mean, in the 1930s, it made sense to treat organisms as black boxes because that's the level at which we were working. Now you've got molecular biology and all of these things, and I see wonderful things happening, but I'm very uncomfortable about talking about it as an extended synthesis in the sense that, it's a post-paradigm or something like that. I see this as all part of the natural growth. Now, I think there are reasons why there's opposition to evolutionary biology, and I don't think it's just, or Darwinism, it's obviously not just crude fundamentalism, because people like Jerry Fodor are not crude fundamentalists, nor is Thomas Nagel. I'm not sure about Plantinga, but certainly Nagel isn't. And I personally think there are other reasons. But my own hobby horse, if you like, is that I think that too many people take Darwinism as a science and quickly convert it into a secular religion. I think that Richard Dawkins, my God, read the God Delusion, for Christ's sakes. For anybody's sake. This is an Old Testament prophet. So I see an awful lot of us Darwinians, if you like, we Darwinians, taking our theory and making more of it. Read Jerry Coyne's blog, for instance, and all the stuff he wants to say about free will. He's clearly extracting, he thinks, from Darwinism about free will, contrary to Christianity. I don't think it's true. But I see there are good reasons why people don't much care for Darwinism. But I don't think it's because the theory as science is inadequate or gone the wrong way or needs, almost, as I say, a kind of post-paradigm thing. So I have a feeling at this point, Fraser and I there really is a gulf between us on this one. Am I right?
I'm not sure, Michael.
No, you don't have to be nice to me because, you're a Christian.
I'm not too fussed whether we count the extended synthesis as a new paradigm or not. I don't much care about that. I just think that it's a step in the right direction towards a more faithful understanding, accurate understanding of how evolution has happened, and it would stir up less opposition than a simplistic kind of Darwinism.
Now, I may be getting people in the wrong areas, people who hold up their hands, so forgive me, but can we try, so the back, 3 rows back, either Harris or the person next to Harris?
Hi, thank you. This is really a question for Otline, but feel free, anyone can jump in. I really like what you're saying about the multi-level analysis, but all the levels you've been talking about really been plant level. What happens in other multi-level type analysis, like predictive neuroscience, when you combine the human social level analysis with biological levels of analysis? They use the same maths modeling processes, but they talk about the social and the biological as if they are essentially just different levels of the same thing that can be analysed in exactly the same way. Is there a problem with that, or can you comment on that?
No, so my slide that kind of talks about molecular, cellular, kind of organism, you could keep going for as far as you wanted on that. You can see you can certainly see an organism as you know, or a kind of ecosystem or a niche or whatever, as a collection, a self-organizing collection of organisms that interact systemically and locally. And I don't see why you can't do that. I mean, again, it's not my field, in a neuroscience and a kind of
I wonder,
direction.
with the human social level, you've got everything's conceptually formed, you've got like practices, you've got ideas, you've got histories, communities. I wonder if that is more of a challenge to that kind of mathematic modeling process, such that you can't necessarily combine the two or treat them as if they're just the next level up. There's something completely new in human society, this sort of the ideas and the conceptually formed elements.
Gosh. So it depends. To me, it would. It's way out of my area. I don't really know what's going on, but the way I map that onto the way I think about things would be that the social things you're talking about are effectively environmental variables. They're kind of equivalent, and so what culture you grew up in is at some level an external influence on how you think, I suppose. But of course, you're part of that culture and you're contributing. So it's not a one-way influence; it's a two-way influence, and in fact, it's a multi-way influence. So I think you can use that same heuristic in that context. I don't have any idea about how useful that is as a heuristic in that context, because I don't know how many of those things you can measure and capture and how many of those things you can meaningfully perturb to explore whether it helps you in thinking about it. But that's it.
Great, we'll move on. So can we have the person next to you and then the person in front? Did you still want on the other side? That's correct. Did you still have a question you wanted to ask or a point to make?
Yes, the first isn't so much a question, but it's to Michael on organicism. Out of Yale University, the Forum on Religion and Ecology, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm and Brian Swim did a documentary called Journey of the Universe, in which now they offer as a MOOC, which you can, I know it's an odd term, massively online course. And it essentially does the same thing in that what they're doing is they're creating a story of the universe, but they're tying all life together in this kind of holistic sphere. So it might be interesting for you to look into that, because the language in it is just rich with a spiritual sense of just beauty, I suppose. I have a question for Autoline, and I apologize if this is a little intense and a little direct and personal, but I noticed when you were speaking in your conclusion, when you mentioned when you were talking about the parts, and you said that I'm going to terribly paraphrase, but you mentioned that it was beautiful. Now, I don't know if consciously or unconsciously, but you made a slight hesitation before you said beautiful, which to me, as a sociologist, I noticed. It was like, pow, right in my face. So looking back, like thinking of Giordano Bruno, for example, and his descriptions of the cosmos that he had, and just thinking of my work and what I'm hoping to accomplish. Can you just, if you feel comfortable, you can tell me later if you want, but can you tell me what it is that you meant, like, truly by the word beautiful in that moment?
Gosh. short answer, no, of course I can't tell you truly what I meant by the word beautiful in that moment. But, but what I feel about the systems that we're working on, you know, that they are beautiful. They're very elegant in the way that they link the different levels in the system, or even within the level in the system, just how those things do what they do, to me, is very beautiful. And I am not remotely kind of abashed or ashamed about that, and I think that is core to the motivations for a lot of scientists, is that maths as well. I mean, just the way these things work is wonderful and exciting and very satisfying in all kinds of ways.
Oh, thank you.
I can't resist using my chair's privilege to say one of the things we fail to do in schools, in my experience, almost entirely, is to help students understand the appropriateness of an aesthetic for good intellectual learning. So when you're teaching people maths between the ages of 16 and 18, you have failed, but you haven't helped them to understand why certain proofs are more attractive than other proofs, even though they reach the same ends. But sadly, it's done rarely. It's done well in certain bits, obviously like the arts in schools, but it's not done well in sciences and mathematics in schools, in my experience. Last sort of one or 2 points. You were definitely the next person.
I'm a teacher, so it's really interesting that you've just said that, because I'm interested in what Dr. Watts said at the end about dissemination and public understanding. And I feel that there is a huge divide between the accessibility between researchers and practitioners who are trying to teach young minds. And I'm concerned about the accessibility of that research and often the format in which our young students receive that, which is generally through social media. And so I wonder if there's been any ideas around how we get these valuable thoughts to teachers far quicker than we are receiving them, and how our curriculums can respond far quicker, because I feel that we're almost out of date. Are probably still teaching in a mono-causal deterministic way, simply because that's how curriculum works in very discrete subjects. Whereas what I'm hearing is a lot of interdisciplinary stuff, which is interesting for me, and is the way that I prefer to teach anyway. But has there been any discussion around how we get this to the schools quicker?
It's a question you've directed to me, but actually I think our chairman's far better qualified to answer this.
I will briefly say that's music to my ears, as
Yes.
you may guess. A small part of this particular project is beginning to try to do that towards the end, and I think it's perfectly okay to say that I know that TWCF is thinking further ahead about what, if anything, does it want to see being done.
Because I'm from New Zealand, so you know the accessibility of that information is very far to come to these conferences. But when I told my colleagues I was going to a conference on science and religion, they were quite perplexed. The fact that you actually put those two together, because religion is not necessarily a positive thing in many societies. So I also was considering how one would be able to teach religion without actually using the word religion, rather teaching it within a historical context, because to me it is so critical in understanding science as well. So how does that information get disseminated across the seas, really?
Thank you. We'll have a very quick response from Andrew Briggs, perhaps, and then the last question or comment will be down here.
Templeton World Charity Foundation has just awarded recently a grant for Christians in Science activity in New Zealand. Are you in touch with that? Because they may be able to give you wonderful resources to support you in your work.
I'll talk to you afterwards.
Thank you, Andrew. And then the final, as it were, from the floor, and the microphone is very slowly making its way towards Paul and then coming down towards you. Last comment or question for any one or more of our panelists. Yes. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, all of you, for the interesting interventions. And I would Buddhism was mentioned several times during this time, and I wanted to make a question related with the Buddhist outlook of the world. Several times I was thinking that the Buddhist conception of the world is like a mechanism, but not any mechanism, but a torture mechanism. Yes, and maybe the organism view is much more consistent with the linear conception of time of Christianity, where an organism is born, then lives and dies. But in Buddhist worldview, it seems that the world is an uncreated torture mechanism, yes? With the basic feeling of dissatisfaction based on the idea of impermanence. And what do you think? It is basically a question addressed to Michael Reiss, yes? Sorry. That how can this model of the torture mechanism, uncreated torture mechanism, be consistent with the organism model?
Thank you.
Yeah?
Well, I don't know that metaphors have to be consistent. I mean, I was thinking about that after my talk, and I was wondering why I was able to be quite as ecumenical as I was. And of course, the fact is, we're dealing with metaphors, if you like, not with objective reality or whatever that is. And I look upon metaphors as, in many respects, as deeply heuristic. And I then, you know, my attitude is, if it works, then go with it. If it gives you some insights, and I'm a little bit like Ottilie. These are things I don't worry about terribly, whether or not they're entirely. I mean, they're not things which could be consistent in quite that way, because they are metaphors, and I'm not sure that metaphors are true or false. Ultimately, they're useful or not useful. And my feeling about this is, obviously, both of these has been useful. The question is, has one run out of steam? Or I think Fraser would want to say, no, in fact, it's a lot more useful than you recognize, Mike Reiss, and yours isn't quite as useful as you think it is. And, you know, that's, I think, is the level at which we're arguing, rather than is it black or is it white?
Well, I mean, obviously we want to thank our three speakers, but it's also these sort of sessions, a proper 45 minutes, they only work if those of you who are there really contribute well. So thank yourselves as well as these three. Thank you.